The island nation of Japan is located in East Asia in the Pacific Ocean. Japan, including all of its numerous islands, covers a total area of 377,955 square kilometers. It is surrounded by the East China Sea in the south, the North Pacific in the east, the Sea Okhotsk in the north, and the Sea of Japan in the west. The most important cities in Japan at that time were its capital city, Edo, which is Tokyo today, and several trader cities on the island of Nagasaki. At that time, Japan had a feudalist government. This meant that society was divided into classes. The top class consisted of the emperor, and he was only ceremonial and had no real power to make actual decisions regarding the government. Then came the shogun, who was the military ruler. He ruled the government, and the title passes to the son. He was followed by the daimyo, who ruled individual lands, rich nobles, and he answered to the shogun. He was followed by all the samurais, and they were all responsible to one daimyo in their area, and samurais were responsible to protect Japan and protect the land, protect the people. Samurais were followed by ronins. They were free samurais without daimyos. Then came the peasants, who took care of the land, and they followed the rules of the daimyo in their area. They were followed by artisans who made products out of natural resources, such as, for example, weapons or clothing. And the lowest class were merchants, who sold products made by artisans and food made by peasants. The reasons why they were the bottom class was because they didn't actually produce anything themselves, but because they were dependent on others. So as you already know, the Japanese society was organized in classes. The emperor was the most important person. He was followed by the shogun, the daimyos, samurais, ronins, peasants, artisans, and merchants. So before the Europeans arrived in Japan, the main religion practiced there was the Shinto religion, but there were also some Buddhists in Japan. When the Europeans arrived, they started converting many Japanese to Christians, which was one of the reasons why Europeans ended up being expulsed from Japan. Also, following Chinese cultures and traditions, Japan believed in Confucianism, which is the idea that an ideal society is based around agriculture rather than commerce, which you can see when you look at the classes. The merchants are very unimportant. Although Japan was isolated during that period of time, there were still some things that they desired from other countries and some things that other countries tried to get from Japan. So Japan imported firearms and weapons, which they got through the Dutch in the port of Nagasaki, and they exported coal and whales for oil, although it was not always legal because some foreigners would only fish for whales around Japan, never actually entering the land because they weren't allowed to. So during the Japanese isolation, they didn't have a lot of trading partners from the outside world. Their main partners were the Dutch that were allowed into Japan but restricted onto the island of Nagasaki. Before the isolation, Japan's trading partners were the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Chinese. And after the isolation, their main trading partners were the US Americans and the British. How did other countries affect Japan? During the period of isolationism, Japan was minimally affected by other countries since they didn't really have any contact to the outside world. Before the isolation, though, Japan's society was influenced by China, changing their social system to Confucianism. Additionally, Japan was strongly influenced by the Europeans entering Japan and converting Japanese Shintos to Christians. The fact that missionaries converted Japanese to another religion was the first push for Japan to close its borders to the outside world. So how did Japan interact with other countries? Japan didn't really interact with other countries during the isolation, but when the Portuguese and Spanish arrived in Japan, their missionaries started converting many people to Christians. By 1612, the shogun's residents of Tokugawa lands had been ordered to forswear Christianity. More restrictions came in 1616, where there was the restriction of foreign trade to Nagasaki and Hirado, an island northwest of Kyushu, and then came the final expulsion of the Spanish in 1624 and the execution of thousands of Christians in 1629. Finally, the Closed Country Edict of 1635 prohibited any Japanese from traveling outside Japan or if someone left from ever returning. By then, the only foreigners allowed in Japan were the Dutch, since they correctly paid respect and tributes to Japan and followed their traditions. They were restricted to Dejima, a small island in Nagasaki's harbor, which became the only trading port and trading city. Only 19 men were allowed in the port. Other Europeans who landed on Japanese land were put to death without trial. This was Japan's only anchor point to the outside world, and every time a foreign ship would arrive in Japan, they would have to bring the news information from Europe to the shogun. For the next 200 years, this small port run by Dutch was Japan's only access to the outside world and Europe's only access to Japan. So, how was Japan changed by its experience with foreign trade and its interaction with foreigners? Japan's society and history was strongly influenced by Europeans and foreign trade. Before the isolation, Japan's society was influenced by Chinese cultures and traditions, changing their social system to Confucianism, meaning their society was based around agriculture rather than commerce. Additionally, Japan was strongly influenced by Europeans entering Japan and converting Japanese Shintos to Christians. The fact that missionaries slowly converted the Shintoist and Buddhist Japanese to Christians was the first push for Japan to close their borders. After Europeans acted disrespectful several times again, Japan closed up its borders, which was followed by 250 years of isolation and stability. Although the Japanese isolation brought 250 years of stability, it had several disadvantages. Due to the isolation, Japan fell behind in many areas, such as, for example, weapons and other inventions. European countries had a lot more time to develop ideas and also get inspired by neighboring countries. Also, despite the fact that the stability was a good thing for Japan, the isolation brought a specific agitation to the country. Since the country was as peaceful as it had never been before, the samurai suddenly had no occupation, which brought disorder to the Japanese class system, having the merchants grow in importance. So then, in the mid-1800s, new foreigners had targeted Japan. So Japan was being pressured to open up its borders by the Russians in the north, the British in the south, and the Americans in the east. The Japanese were very well aware of the fact that foreigners were arriving. However, the government was split, so one group was suggesting to build warships and fight the intruders, while the other group said that they didn't even have a slight chance since they hadn't changed their technology in 200 years, and so that they should just let the foreigners in and open their borders. So on July 2nd in 1853, the fishers spotted the ships arriving. They thought the ships were on fire, while it was actually steamships running on coal. and they called them evil black ships. The Americans landed in the forbidden waters of the Iwo Bay, the shogun's only city, making him fall ill because of the knowledge of foreigners being at his doorsteps. The Americans felt very inferior to Japan and requested that Japan opens its borders to American trade. So they threatened the Japanese to attack them and colonize them if they didn't agree. Leaving the Japanese a little bit of time to decide, the Americans left Japan, and in February the Americans returned earlier than planned with twice as many ships and crew members. So after 23 days of negotiations, a treaty was signed saying that Japan will open up its borders, keep in control of their own government, but trading with the US. And a similar treaty was signed with Russia, England, France, and Holland, making 250 years ruling of Tokugawa family come to end when the 15th shogun steps down in 1858. So trade and interaction with foreigners affected Japan in two main ways. It was the reason why Japan closed its borders in the first place, cutting itself off from the outside world and falling behind 200 years regarding inventions and technology. But it was also the reason why Japan opened up, because it lost its stability and foreigners threatened Japan. So foreigners made Japan close their borders because of the way they acted, but they also made Japan reopen its borders because of the threats they sent out.